Thwarting Putin's aims in Ukraine required that Ukraine become more stable politically, less corrupt, and more prosperous economically than it was during the first quarter century of its post-Soviet independence. Western economic assistance would not by itself reverse Ukraine's political and economic trajectory, but it would be an indispensable part of any formula for such a reversal. European security after the Russian assault on Ukraine bore a military resemblance to its Cold War predecessor as well. On both occasions, the Russians sought to overturn the status quo and the United States to preserve it. That made the Western military mission in post-Cold War Europe the same one that it had undertaken during the Cold War: deterrence. In both periods, a secure and peaceful Europe required that Western armed forces, in concert with Western diplomacy and Western economic weight, dissuade Russia from doing to other countries what it did in 2014 to Ukraine. As from the late 1940s to the early 1990s, the policy of deterrence had to be carried out under the shadow of American and Russian nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons contributed to a particular 21st century strategic problem for the United States and NATO that echoed one of the major Cold War challenges with which they had had to cope. In the earlier period, the NATO allies were committed to defending West Berlin, a Western island with free elections and economic, religious, and political liberty located 80 miles inside communist East Germany, which enjoyed none of these freedoms. Surrounded as it was by communist-controlled territory, West Berlin could not be defended successfully against a determined attack by troops and tanks. Only a token Western force was stationed there, and if a war broke out, adequate reinforcements would not be able to reach the western part of the city to keep it from being overrun and conquered. The security of West Berlin, therefore, rested on deterrence based on the Western threat, usually an implicit one, to resort to the use of nuclear weapons in response to a concerted attack. Once begun, there was no telling how a nuclear war would end. Similarly, post-Cold War NATO came to include Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, 3 tiny countries that had once been part of the Soviet Union. All 3 had borders both on the Baltic Sea and with Russia, as well as minority populations of ethnic Russians. Russia conducted campaigns of harassment against the 3 countries, and Putin was quoted as saying that, "If I wanted, Russian troops could not only be in Kiev in 2 days, but in Riga, Vilnius, Tallinn, the capitals of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia respectively, Warsaw or Bucharest too." Defending them against a determined Russian attack would encounter some of the same logistical difficulties that the defense of West Berlin had presented, including, in the worst case, a perilous choice between accepting a military defeat and bringing nuclear weapons into play. Another issue, economic in nature, but with political considerations and a staple of intra-alliance politics in the West during the Cold War, resurfaced with the return of security competition in Europe. Known as burden sharing, it concerned the contribution each NATO member made to the common task of deterring Russia. As during the Cold War, the Europeans, although more directly threatened by reason of geography, spent a smaller proportion of their national outputs on defense than did the United States. The recurrent Cold War-era effort by successive American administrations to coax, cajole, bully, and shame them into spending more emerged from its post-Cold War hibernation. While the new security competition in some ways resembled the Cold War, it did not fully duplicate the 20th century rivalry. The later conflict differed from the earlier one in important ways. Not the least important was the fact that post-Soviet Russia was smaller and less powerful than its Soviet predecessor. It had lost 1/4 of the territory of the Soviet Union and 1/2 of its population, most of it non-Russian. Despite its energy resources, it had an economy of only modest size.